NTE, Neverness to Everness is one of those games that almost dares you to be cynical about it before you even press start. It is another anime-styled action gacha. It launches into a market that is already crowded with games promising flashy combat, collectible characters, daily progression, and a world that supposedly feels alive for months or years instead of just a weekend. At this point, that pitch alone is not enough. Players have seen too many games arrive with polished trailers, strong first impressions, and just enough friction under the surface to make the whole thing feel disposable once the honeymoon period ends. That is why NTE is interesting. Not because it completely reinvents the genre, it does not. Not because it suddenly solves every problem that live service anime RPGs have been dragging around for years. It definitely does not. NTE stands out because it understands something a lot of its competitors still struggle with. If you want people to keep coming back to a world, that world has to feel worth inhabiting even when they are not chasing the next damage spike, the next banner, or the next checklist of dailies. And that is where Neverness to Everness gets its hooks in. Hotta Studio has built a game that borrows a lot of familiar action, RPG language, but then folds it into something that feels more domestic, more social, and honestly, more curious than I expected. This is a game that wants to be an action gacha, a city sim, a life sim, a social sandbox, and a routine generator all at once. That is a risky mix because when games try to do too many things at the same time, they usually end up feeling thin in all of them. But NTE gets farther on that ambition than I thought it would. It does not land every part of that vision cleanly. The launch build has technical issues. The story loses momentum once progression gates start interrupting it. Some characters get far more attention than others, and not always the ones you want to spend more time with. But even with all of that, Hethereau, the city at the center of the game, is strong enough to carry a lot of the experience. That is the real headline here. NTE is one of the few gacha games in this lane that feels designed to be lived in, not just cleared. And once that clicked for me, a lot of the game's strengths started making more sense. The first thing that really sells NTE is not scale. It is density. A lot of open world games still chase size as if size alone creates immersion. Bigger maps, longer travel routes, more empty land between points of interest, more visual sprawl. NTE goes in a different direction. Hethereau is not trying to overwhelm you with sheer landmass. Instead, it tries to convince you that people actually exist here, that routines exist here, that this city keeps moving whether you are in combat or not. That difference matters immediately. The districts feel layered. Streets are packed with storefronts, apartments, transit routes, side activities, and anomaly incidents that bleed into the city's normal rhythm instead of feeling like isolated combat bubbles. You are not just running across a giant field to the next objective marker. You are moving through a place that has texture. You see interiors. You see little variations in side locations. You get the sense that the city was built as a setting first and a combat container second. That is a big reason why the obvious comparison people will make is Grand Theft Auto, even though the tone is completely different. The resemblance is structural, not tonal. NTE uses an urban sandbox framework, but instead of leaning into chaos, crime, or satire, it uses that framework for something softer and stranger. This is a city built around errands, routines, transit, side jobs, weird supernatural disruptions, and the feeling that ordinary life and paranormal nonsense are constantly brushing up against each other. That contrast gives the game a lot of its identity. When you are walking through a normal block, checking out shops, moving between activities, or just taking in the city layout, NTE can feel almost cozy. Then an anomaly tears through the skyline, or a familiar space gets distorted by something supernatural, and suddenly the city has this sharp visual snap to it. That tension between the everyday and the unreal is one of the best things the game has going for it. It keeps Hethereau from feeling like just another pretty anime backdrop. It feels like a place with a pulse. And honestly, that pulse does a lot of work for the rest of the game, because the premise itself is not exactly revolutionary. You are dealing with an amnesiac protagonist, mysterious powers, and a convenient entry point into a larger organization. None of that is new. The player becomes the appraiser after getting caught up in the hyper-vortex anomaly above Hethereau and then getting pulled into the orbit of the Bureau of Anomaly Control. On paper, that sounds like the kind of setup you have seen a dozen times before in adjacent games. What helps NTE early on is the scale of its framing. Instead of immediately telling you that you are the singular, chosen savior around whom the entire universe revolves, the game initially places you in Ibon, an antiques shop turned investigation agency. That smaller setup gives the opening hours a more grounded feel. You are not instantly standing at the center of cosmic destiny. You are one capable anomaly hunter among other people with their own roles, their own personalities, and their own place in the city. That makes the early story easier to buy into. It gives the game local texture. You are not just saving the world in the abstract, you are learning how the city works, how its weirdness is managed, and how its people live around that weirdness. That is a much stronger opening note than the genre usually gives us. The cast helps too. Mint is especially effective early on. She has the kind of presence that makes scenes move. The broader roster also has enough personality that dialogue stays lively, even when the plot itself is moving along familiar rails. The writing knows the audience it is speaking to. References to anime and game culture show up in a way that feels natural enough to register as character texture instead of desperate wink-wink fan service. That is a harder balance than it sounds. A lot of games in this space either overdo that kind of self-aware writing until it becomes exhausting, or they play everything so straight that the cast feels interchangeable. NTE usually lands somewhere in the middle. It is comfortable with its tone, it knows what kind of audience it is talking to, and for a while, that confidence carries the story pretty well. What I also appreciate is that the early game does not rush to explain every mystery into the ground. It gives you enough to stay curious, enough to understand the broad shape of the world, and enough character interaction to make the setup feel inhabited. That restraint helps. In a lot of live service RPGs, the opening hours are so desperate to establish lore, factions, terminology, and future stakes that they end up flattening the immediate experience. NTE is better when it stays smaller. It is better when it lets a case, a district, or a character interaction carry the scene instead of constantly pointing towards some giant future revelation. That smaller scale confidence is part of why the opening feels fresh even when the ingredients are familiar. You are not being asked to care about the entire cosmology all at once. You are being asked to care about this city. That is a much easier emotional sell, and it is the right one. But only for a while, because the story absolutely starts to lose momentum once the progression structure gets in its way. This is probably the biggest narrative problem in the game right now. Individual story beats are often enjoyable. Some of the case-driven scenarios work well on their own. There are moments where the setup, the city, and the cast all line up, and you can see the version of NTE that could become genuinely special if it keeps building on those strengths. But the larger structure starts sagging once major story advancement gets locked behind character levels instead of dramatic escalation. That creates a stop-start rhythm that hurts the mystery. You get invested in the next case, the next reveal, the next thread, and then the game tells you to go do side content, grind resources, or just spend time elsewhere until the next chunk unlocks. That kind of gating is common in gacha games, so it is not surprising. But it is still damaging. It breaks the momentum the story works hard to build, and because NTE's early appeal depends so much on atmosphere and local intrigue, that interruption feels especially noticeable here. The game is at its best when it lets you sink into its rhythm. The moment it starts reminding you too aggressively that you are inside a progression economy, some of that magic slips. Character focus also gets uneven as the story goes on. Mint fades from prominence faster than I expected, and that is disappointing because she is one of the characters who helps the opening hours feel sharp and personable. Meanwhile, Tageto ends up taking a lot of side story oxygen. That would be less of an issue if the rest of the cast felt thin, but that is not really the problem. NTE already has a sizable roster with enough personality to justify broader use. So when the game keeps circling back to the same presence too often, the world starts to feel smaller than it should. That is a weird problem for a game with a city this convincing. The setting suggests breadth, the cast suggests breadth, the structure sometimes narrows that breadth anyway. It is not enough to ruin the story, but it does keep the narrative from fully cashing in on the promise of its world. And that is really the frustration. This is not a case where the game lacks interesting people or interesting places. It is a case where the distribution of attention does not always match the strength of the material. You can feel the game brushing up against a richer ensemble piece than the one it actually delivers. There are moments where a side character, a district-specific thread, or a smaller interaction hints at a broader social fabric, and those moments are often more memorable than the larger plot machinery surrounding them. That is why I do not come away from the story thinking it is bad. I come away thinking it is leaving value on the table. There is a difference. Now, if the story is where NTE starts to wobble, combat is where it settles back down. This is not a reinvention of the action gacha formula, and I do not think it needs to be. If you have played games like Zenless Zone Zero or Wuthering Waves, a lot of this will feel immediately legible. You are dealing with team switching, parry timing, elemental interactions through the Esper system, and the usual dance of reading enemy pressure while maintaining your own offensive flow. The important thing is not novelty. The important thing is readability. And NTE is readable. Inputs feel responsive, character swaps are fast enough that combo flow stays intact. Enemy attacks usually give you enough information to react instead of just drowning you in spectacle. That last part matters more than people sometimes admit. A lot of flashy action games look exciting in trailers but become muddy once you're actually playing them, especially when effects start stacking and enemy behavior gets noisy. NTE generally avoids that. It reads cleanly in motion, and that gives the combat a solid baseline even before you start talking about encounter design. That clean readability also makes experimentation less annoying. When a combat system is visually messy or mechanically vague, trying new characters can feel like work because you are fighting the interface as much as the enemies. Here, even when I was still learning how a unit fit into a team, I usually felt like I understood what the game was asking of me. I knew when I mistimed something, I knew when I got greedy, I knew when an enemy pattern had actually outplayed me instead of just disappearing under effects clutter. That clarity builds trust, and trust is a huge part of whether repeated combat stays satisfying. Where the system gets more interesting is when fights disrupt routine. Bosses and anomaly encounters that force projectile parries, repositioning, or adaptation to shifting arenas give the combat a tactical edge beyond simple rotation management. Those are the moments where NTE stops feeling like a checklist of genre standards and starts feeling like a game with its own rhythm. You are not just executing a script, you are reacting, you are adjusting, you are paying attention. That tension is especially effective in the early to mid game, before raw stats start flattening too much of the challenge curve. When the game asks you to actually read the fight instead of just overpowering it, the combat becomes much more memorable. Character differentiation helps too. Balance does not always feel perfectly even across rarities, which is not exactly shocking in a gacha game, but the roster generally avoids one of the genre's most boring traps. Characters do not all feel like cosmetic variations on the same attack string. The stronger units naturally have more expressive kits and cleaner damage ceilings, but there is enough variation in feel and function that building a team still has some personality to it. That matters in a game built around repetition. If you are going to ask players to fight over and over again, the combat needs enough texture that those repetitions do not blur together immediately. NTE is not perfect here, but it is doing enough right that I kept wanting to engage with the system instead of just tolerating it. I also think the game benefits from not overcomplicating its fundamentals too early. There is a temptation in this genre to prove depth by front-loading systems, exceptions, layered currencies, and character-specific caveats until the whole thing starts feeling like homework. NTE has systems, obviously, but it usually introduces them in a way that lets the player build intuition first. That makes the combat easier to enjoy on a moment-to-moment level, and it keeps the game from collapsing into spreadsheet energy every time you want to improve a team. There is also a small but genuinely interesting wrinkle in the progression side of combat, and that is the artifact system. Instead of relying entirely on the usual substat misery machine, NTE frames gear optimization through a Tetris-like console minigame where pieces are slotted to shape stat bonuses. I would not oversell this as some revolutionary breakthrough, because eventually a lot of players are still going to optimize the fun out of it or default to automation, but I do think it changes the feel of gearing in a useful way. It makes optimization feel a little more tactile, a little more interactive, a little less like paperwork. That is a small design choice, but it reflects something I appreciate about NTE overall. Even when it borrows familiar systems, it often tries to present them through a slightly different texture. Not always enough to make them feel brand new, but enough to make them feel less dead on arrival. And that brings me to the part of the game that really separates it from the pack. The life sim layer. This is where NTE stops being just a competent action gacha and starts becoming something more distinctive. It is also where the game takes its biggest creative risk, because once you start layering cafe management, housing, deliveries, fishing, racing, casino activities, and bonding systems into an action RPG, you are making a bet. You are betting that players will not see those features as distractions. You are betting that they will read them as texture. If that bet fails, the whole package starts looking unfocused. If it works, the game suddenly has a much stronger identity than another combat-first gacha with a few token minigames attached. For me, it mostly works. Cafe management, housing, deliveries, fishing, racing, casino activities, character bonding, side jobs, and all the other systems packed into Hethereau could have easily turned into a bloated feature list. That happens all the time. Games pile on side systems because variety looks good in marketing, but once you actually play them, half of those systems feel undercooked and the other half feel like chores. NTE avoids that more often than I expected. Most of these activities are developed enough to justify their presence, and more importantly, they all reinforce the same central idea. Hethereau is not just a combat map with decorative sidewalks. It is a place where people live, work, commute, hang out, and waste time. That is the fantasy the game keeps returning to. Not just power, routine. And routine is a surprisingly powerful thing for a live service game to build around. Because if a world can make you enjoy being there when nothing urgent is happening, that world has a much better chance of surviving the long haul. Driving is a good example of this. It is not best in class. If you come in expecting a top-tier driving model, you are going to be disappointed. But it is competent enough that buying cars, taking taxi work, and entering races feel like meaningful sidetracks instead of throwaway gimmicks. The vehicles are not just props. They are part of how the city expresses itself. That is an important distinction. In weaker games, vehicles are often just traversal shortcuts. Here, they are part of the fantasy of participating in city life. You are not only using them to get somewhere faster, you are using them because the game wants you to think about movement through Hethereau as part of your relationship with the setting. That is why even modest driving systems can carry more weight here than they would in a more conventional open-world RPG. Public transit might be an even better example. Being able to board a bus or train and just watch the city pass by sounds like a tiny feature on paper. In practice, it does a remarkable amount of world-building work. It slows the game down in a good way. It lets the city breathe. It gives you time to absorb the environment as something other than a route between objectives. That is one of the moments where NTE really clicked for me. I stopped thinking about Hethereau as a level and started thinking about it as a routine. That is not a small distinction. A lot of games want to be worlds. Very few actually feel like places you could imagine returning to for reasons other than progression. NTE gets closer to that than most of its peers. And because it gets closer, the quieter moments matter more. Stopping into a shop matters more. Decorating a space matters more. Taking on a side activity for the sake of the activity, not just the reward, matters more. Those are the moments where the game's identity feels strongest, because they are the moments least tied to the usual gacha compulsion loops. They are not free from that economy, but they are not fully defined by it either. Now, that does not mean traversal is polished across the board, because it definitely is not. Climbing and wall running can be unreliable on surfaces that look scalable. Vehicle interaction is rougher than it should be. Entry prompts sometimes lag. It is still too easy to wedge a car or bike into geometry badly enough that respawning becomes the cleanest solution. These are not catastrophic issues in isolation, but they add friction to systems that are supposed to support the game's sense of flow. And on controller, those rough edges stand out more. The PlayStation 5 control scheme is serviceable, but it never feels fully natural. You can play it just fine, but it does not have that pad-first smoothness you get from games that were clearly tuned around controller feel from the ground up. That does not make the game unplayable. It just means you are more aware of the seams. Those seams show up in the technical state too, and this is where the review needs a direct caveat. NTE has real launch window roughness. Soft locks, looping visual effects, missing elevator doors, and other bugs are not minor polish notes when they interrupt play. Performance on PlayStation 5 Pro seems broadly stable from what I have seen, so this is not a case where the whole thing is collapsing under its own weight, but there is enough friction here to remind you that Hotta Studio still has cleanup ahead. That matters, because games like this live and die on trust. Players will forgive a lot during launch windows if they believe the foundation is strong and the developer is moving quickly. They are much less forgiving if technical issues start feeling like part of the game's identity. NTE is not at that point, but it is close enough to the line that the next few updates matter a lot. The audio side fares better. Ambient sound design does a lot to sell Hethereau as a real place. The city sounds inhabited. The English and Japanese voice tracks are both strong overall, even if some English performances may remind you a little too much of familiar genre counterparts. The weak link is the in-car radio, mostly because the track rotation wears thin too quickly. That is the kind of detail that sounds minor until you realize how often the game invites you to spend time in vehicles. Once the repetition sets in, you notice it. Still, on balance, the audio presentation supports the world more than it undermines it. And that support matters because atmosphere is doing so much of the heavy lifting here. If the city did not sound convincing, if the ambient layer felt thin, if the performances failed to sell the cast, a lot of NTE's broader ambition would collapse much faster. This is not a game that survives on combat alone. It needs the connective tissue between activities to feel real enough that you want to stay in the world after the fight ends. And that is important because side content is where NTE's ambition becomes easiest to appreciate. This is another area where the game could have easily fallen apart. A lot of live service games treat side content as filler that exists mainly to feed the next banner cycle. You do your optional modes, you collect your resources, and the whole thing feels transparently instrumental. NTE is not completely free of that logic because no gacha game really is, but it does a better job than most of making optional content feel like part of the world instead of just part of the economy. Pink Paw's Heist is a standout example. This limited time bank robbery mode layers extraction pressure, descending risk, and escalating rewards into one of the sharpest loops in the current build. It is the rare event mode that feels like more than a disposable diversion. It has tension, it has identity, it feels like somebody actually wanted this mode to be fun, not just functional. That is a meaningful compliment in this genre. It is also a good sign for the game's future, at least in theory. If NTE can keep producing side modes that feel this intentional, it has a real chance to avoid one of the biggest live service traps, where every update technically adds content, but very little of that content feels memorable. Players do not just need more things to do, they need things worth remembering. Pink Paw's Heist suggests the team understands that, even if it still has to prove it can sustain that standard over time. Beyond the Rail fills the expected endgame combat role, while Housing Decoration gives Anomaly drops a practical afterlife beyond raw stat progression. That is another smart touch. When optional systems feed back into the broader fantasy of living in the city, they feel more coherent. They stop feeling like disconnected tabs on a menu. That coherence is one of NTE's biggest strengths. Even when the game is messy, it usually knows what fantasy it is trying to sell. And because it knows that, a lot of its systems feel like they belong together. Of course, none of this lets the game escape the monetization conversation. NTE is still a free-to-play gacha game. No amount of city charm changes that. There are banners, there are cosmetics, there are pull-linked outfit rewards, there are long-tail monetization hooks waiting in the background. If you are fundamentally allergic to the gacha model, NTE is not going to convert you through sheer atmosphere. But within that model, its launch structure is more considerate than many of its peers. The biggest example is the absence of a 50-50 failure state on limited banners. That is not a tiny footnote. That is a meaningful quality of life decision. If players hit pity, they get the featured character. That removes one of the most exhausting friction points in the genre right away. And that matters more than flashy marketing language ever could. It changes the emotional texture of pulling. You are still spending resources, you are still participating in a monetized system, but the game is not immediately asking you to accept one of the genre's most notorious forms of disappointment as normal. That does not make the system generous in some absolute sense, it just makes it less antagonistic, and in this space, that difference is meaningful. Combined with early selectors and a reasonably steady flow of resources, the opening economy feels more welcoming than exploitative. I want to be careful here, because launch generosity does not automatically predict long-term generosity. A lot of games know how to make a good first impression before tightening the screws later. So I'm not going to pretend NTE has solved monetization. It has not. What I will say is that right now, it feels less interested in punishing restraint than many of its competitors. And that is worth noting. Whether that lasts is a separate question. The launch window cannot answer it. And honestly, that uncertainty is part of what makes reviewing live service games tricky in the first place. You are not just reviewing what is there, you are also trying to judge whether the foundation deserves confidence. In NTE's case, I think the answer is yes, but with real caveats attached, because this game does not break free from every gacha habit it inherits. Its story pacing stumbles. Its character focus can feel oddly lopsided. Its technical issues are too visible to ignore. Its traversal systems are not polished enough to fully support the fantasy they are aiming for. And if you come in expecting a pure action game, some of the life sim sprawl may feel distracting rather than enriching, but even with all of that, I keep coming back to Hethereau. That is the thing I cannot shake. This city is compelling. Not just pretty, not just marketable. Compelling. And I think that is because the game understands a simple truth that a lot of its competitors miss. People do not only fall in love with systems, they fall in love with habits. They fall in love with routes, neighborhoods, sounds, routines, and the feeling that a world can hold them for a while without constantly demanding peak efficiency. NTE gets closer to that kind of attachment than most games in its lane. It has enough density, enough routine, enough atmosphere, and enough small lived in touches that I wanted to spend time there even when I was not doing the most efficient thing possible. That is rare. It is especially rare in a genre that so often reduces its worlds to resource routes and combat arenas. NTE understands that a live service world needs more than content volume. It needs texture, it needs habits, it needs reasons to return that are not purely numerical. That is where the game feels smarter than a lot of its competition. The combat is responsive enough to support the package. The life sim systems add real texture instead of just filler. The side content often feels like an extension of the world rather than a detached obligation. And the monetization, at least for now, is less punishing than the genre has trained people to expect. That does not make NTE a masterpiece. It does make it one of the more convincing anime-style gacha launches in recent memory. And I think that is the right way to frame it. This is not a game that wins by being flawless, it wins by being persuasive. It persuades you that its city matters. It persuades you that its routines matter. It persuades you that there is value in hanging around this world, even when the main story is stalled, even when the next banner is not calling your name, even when you are just taking a train ride, checking in on side systems, or wandering through another district to see what kind of weirdness is waiting there. That is a real achievement. And it is also why I think people should calibrate their expectations correctly. If you go in looking for the most mechanically demanding action game in the genre, NTE probably will not be your new gold standard. If you go in looking for a perfectly polished launch, it definitely will not be. If you go in with zero tolerance for gacha structures, the game's better instincts are not going to erase the business model. But if what you want is an anime-style live service RPG that feels like it has an actual sense of place, one that gives you more to do than just fight and pull, one that understands the appeal of urban routine as much as supernatural spectacle, then NTE has something real to offer. Now the question is whether Hotta Studio can protect that achievement, because the next few updates are going to matter a lot. If the studio cleans up the technical roughness, smooths out traversal, and finds a better way to preserve story momentum through progression, NTE could become something genuinely special in this space. If it leans too hard into the usual live service bad habits, if the monetization gets meaner, if the city starts feeling like a backdrop for banner churn instead of a place with its own identity, then a lot of what makes the game interesting right now could erode fast. That is the tension sitting underneath this whole review. NTE already has the hard part. It has a world worth caring about. Now it has to prove it can sustain that world without sanding down the very qualities that make it stand out. As it stands right now, Neverness to Everness is rough, ambitious, uneven, and surprisingly easy to like. It does not fully escape the gravity of its genre, but it pushes against that gravity in ways that feel meaningful. And in a market this crowded, that alone makes it worth paying attention to. If you want a clean verdict, here it is. NTE. Neverness to Everness is one of the most promising anime-style gacha launches in recent memory. Not because it reinvents the formula, but because it gives that formula a city that actually feels alive. The story is inconsistent. The launch build is rough. Some systems need more polish, but Hethereau works, the combat works, the life sim layer works. And together, those pieces create a game that feels more lived in, more textured, and more worth returning to than most of its direct competition. Right now, I think that is enough to recommend it with caution. Not blind enthusiasm, not doom posting. Cautious enthusiasm. Because if the developers support this thing well, NTE could carve out a real identity for itself. And if they do not, it will still be remembered as a launch that briefly showed how much more interesting this genre can feel when a world is built to be inhabited instead of merely consumed. For now, that leaves Neverness to Everness in a strong position. Imperfect, but persuasive. Familiar, but textured. Crowded by competition, but distinct enough to matter. And that is why, at least in its current state, I come away from NTE more impressed than disappointed.